Hello, my name's Alan Fu, and today I'm going to talk about energy and G7. Key point here is G7, the top 7 industrialized countries in the world, are not as important as they used to be in the energy landscape. They're still important, but less so. So just recently, in June 2021, the G7 had its annual meeting in Cornwall in the UK, where I live. I don't live in Cornwall, I live in the UK. And there's quite a lot of focus on climate, quite a lot of focus on energy, particularly with COP26 coming up, which the UK is also hosting. Very strong commitment by the British government to get to a net zero in terms of CO2 emissions and to develop a non-fossil fuel-based energy system. Quite how successful they'll be at that is another question, but their commitment is there. There's also the new Biden-Harris administration in the USA, which have quite a different attitude from the previous lot. A lot of resolutions, a lot of promises, pledges to increase green investment and green aid. So here you have caricatures of the world G7 leaders in Cornwall by the nice Cornish seaside, having a really good time. So key point here is what is the G7 and what's been going on. So G7 was established in 1973, has USA, Japan, Germany, France, Italy, UK, and Canada. So that's those countries in blue on this world map. And here's a graph showing the relative share of the different energy systems of the G7 relative to the whole world. So oil is in red, gas is in sky blue, dark grey is coal, yellow is electricity. So 1990, G7 consumed 44% of the world's energy. It's now down to 28%. 1990, G7 produced 41% of the world's CO2. It's now down to just under a quarter. And of the G7, the USA is by far the largest consumer of energy. But there's also another group of people, the BRICS. So that's Brazil, Russia, China, India, and South Africa. So that's these countries colored in green here, all of whom are very large countries. South Africa is a bit smaller than others. And they've established informal summits in the early 2000s. It's not quite the same as the G7, but they're a useful comparator set of countries. So the BRICS, that's these green countries, consumed 24% of the world's primary energy in 1990, 38% in 2019. 26%, just over a quarter, of the world's CO2 in 1990, now to 43%. And the key point here is that BRICS, along with most of the rest of the developing world, are not subject to CO2 restrictions within either the Paris Agreement or the previous Kyoto Agreement in the same way that industrialized countries are. Because they're developing, they're poorer, they wish to grow. Quite how that will work out in the future is another question, because obviously they're now becoming a more significant CO2 source. So if you're worried about CO2, you need to think about this. Comparing G7 to the BRICS, so that's looking at oil, gas, coal, and electricity as a share of the world total. You can see that coal is way more important within the BRICS. So India and China are very significant coal-consuming countries. Brazil much less so. Russia a bit less so. South Africa is a smaller country, but very coal-intensive as well. In terms of gas, the industrialized world, G7, is a little bit higher than others because Russia is the only really big consumer amongst the BRICS of gas because they have a lot of gas themselves. The others have not so much. And then again, oil, they've had a steady rise, whereas this has had a steady fall. And looking at oil, gas, and coal together, where you have the G7s in a slightly lighter colors and the BRICS in a slightly darker colors, you can see, particularly in coal, the rise of massive coal consumption in China and India and how that's influenced that. In terms of natural gas, growth in the BRICS, but also growth in the G7. In terms of oil, stasis, perhaps a little bit of a decline in the G7, but growth in the BRICS. So the two are coming up pretty much neck and neck on oil, although not quite there yet. Different on gas, different on coal. But again, you have to look at both of them. So this is a series of graphs that I've made based on data from the BP Statistical Review of World Energy. So this is looking at primary energies. That's all energy that's used by all the different countries. So I'll explain a little bit about the colors. So the blue colors are the G7. This large chunk of the pie is the United States, and then you have all the others along here. So that's those. The sky blue color here is the rest of the OECD. So that's all the other OECD countries that are not part of the G7. So that's the rest of the EU, Australia, South Korea, Mexico, etc., etc., etc. So that's all these colors. The non-OECD part are the pink and the salmon pink color. So this pink color here are the BRICS. So that's Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And this is the remainder of the non-OECD. Again, you're now getting to non-OECD is approaching to, almost 60% of the world's share. In terms of oil consumption, a similar-ish sort of story. So again, BRICS, rest of the non-OECD, that obviously includes the Middle East, so countries like Saudi Arabia that use an awful lot of oil. And then the G7, again, America having the lion's share of the G7, almost slightly more than the rest of the G7 combined. But again, a decline in relative share, which is this yellow-orange line relative to the rest. Natural gas, growth everywhere, although a decline in the relative share of the G7. Coal, massive growth in China primarily, with a little bit of India as well. Now you can see the BRICS, China and India, almost 2/3 of the total. China has 52% of the world's coal, India has 12%. Electricity, massive growth here, mainly growth within China, but a relative decline within the G7. And you can see the notch here, which is a 2008 financial crisis, and there'll be another notch in 2020 due to the COVID response. A little bit about CO2. Again, rise everywhere else. Relative decline in the G7. To some of that is due to deindustrialization within Europe and to some extent the US, and also the switching from coal to gas in US electricity generation due to fracking. And a little bit of that is also due to renewables, although that's a relatively small number so far. That's set to grow in the future. So let's look at primary shares of energy by fuel, comparing the world, the G7 and the BRICS. The world has 84% of the world's primary energy is derived from fossil fuels. Oil in red, gas in sky blue, coal in dark gray, everything else in the yellow orange. So that everything else includes nuclear, includes hydro, includes wind, includes solar, biomass, etc. So 84% of the world is fossil fuel powered. If you're looking at G7, down to 80%. Coal, significant decline due to it being switched out. Growth in gas. Oil is still 38% of world energy. BRICS, look at a coal pile. China, India are very coal heavy, as is South Africa. Russia less so, Brazil even less so. But if you wish to reduce CO2 emissions of the world, you really need to give China and India something else to generate electricity from effectively, safely, reliably, other than coal. If you're looking at oil demand forecasts, so this is a little bit of work that I've did elsewhere. So history is in dark gray. So we have America, Japan, China, and India, the four biggest consumers, although I've done the work for the top 25 countries. So what you can see is America had a rise in oil consumption, then decline as a result of recession, a little bit of a rise, and now we don't know what happened. So this was the decline in 2020, which at the time of writing I wasn't sure what was going to be, and these are potential high, medium, and low cases going forwards. Japan has been in a very low decline. Again, decline in 2008, then an uptick after the Fukushima, which they used a lot of oil to generate electricity as an emergency. Then a decline, and then long-term decline in overall oil consumption because of the way Japan's industry and society is going. The two biggest BRICS countries, so this is China, again, either a big rise, and then we don't know what's going to happen next. Could flatten off, could rise slower, or could rise very fast. We don't know. That's the joys of forecasting. As Yogi Bear said, predictions are difficult, especially about the future. Then you have India, again, fall, and then is it going to rise very slowly? Is it going to rise slightly faster? Or is it going to accelerate? In the high case, we don't know. But the key point here is that in case of the G7, and Japan's profile is typical to the European countries as well, You have decline overall consumption. USA, rise, fall, possibly stasis. We don't know. Whereas the G7, whereas outside the G7, in the developing countries, rapid rise in China, rapid rise in India. Russia's kind of flat, as is South Africa and Brazil, but they're somewhat less important than the big two. The other one that needs looking at is when you look at the fossil fuel consumption of China and Britain on exactly the same scale. So these scales are exactly the same in terms of tons of oil equivalent. So this is China, this is Britain. And the yellow line is CO2 emissions. So again, coal in dark grey, oil in red, gas in sky blue. China consumes relatively little gas relative to other large countries because they don't have that much of it internally. They have to import quite a lot of their gas. But they do have a lot of coal. They still import coal, but they have a lot of indigenous coal. So if you want to have less CO2 emissions, you've got to give the Chinese an alternative to this. This also shows how relatively unimportant Britain is. We as a country don't really matter that much. But then there's another thing that we need to look at is CO2 outsourcing. Now there's a piece of work that was done by Carbon Brief, so there's the link at the bottom, looking at CO2 imports and exports. So that's the amount of CO2 which is generated within the country and the amount of CO2 which is generated by the country's activities. So for example, if we look at the USA here, they generate this much CO2 within the country, but they also do quite a lot of importing. So that's CO2 embedded in imported products right here. Whereas China, because they export a lot, have this negative number on here. And the UK has proportionately more CO2 imports relative to its own indigenous CO2 creation. So maybe Britain ought not to be quite so smug. So let's just have a look through the key points again. So the G7 is not as important as it was in the energy landscape, but it's still important. Particularly the USA, which has over half of CO2 emissions, half of energy consumption within the G7. And also a lot more uncertainty about where it's going into the future, because you can map their other countries out relatively precisely because they have trends which are long-term. The differences in priorities within the G7. The UK and Germany can be summarized as climate crusaders, people for whom climate is very important and wish to impose climate values on other countries. One could argue about Japan, France, and Italy being a slightly lighter shade of green. They're very prioritized on climate change, but less so, or at least they shout a lot less than the UK and Germany do. Then you have the USA and Canada, which have mixed views within their societies. Now, okay, the Democrats are in power in the USA, and Trudeau is in power in Canada, who are very green relative to the others, but their society is not united. And their countries, their constitutions have checks and balances, so that's something which may need to do. But all of the G7 countries either on plateau declining in terms of energy demand. It might be not so much in the USA. That's the big thing that's more uncertain. Whereas BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa are now more important, if not more so in the energy landscape, because they're mostly growing countries. And their priorities are poverty elimination and economic growth, to get their citizens mired out of poverty. If you look at the millions of Chinese and Indians, hundreds of millions of people who used to be absolutely destitute and now have a much better life. There are, however, local environmental considerations in these countries where people worry about pollution. They're secondary, but they're growing. As countries get richer, they tend to worry more about pollution. But there's a need for more dialogue, more understanding, rather than having monologue and preachy. So this is the G7 meeting. The next contestants for the series of Love Island. I think I prefer the rather buff people, but we have what we have. So thank you very much for your time. I'll see you on the next one.